And then, of course, right, you're serious when they send you some deals, you underwrite them, you give them feedback and say, well, yes, I love the deal, but this is what works for me and what doesn't work and so forth. So I think, hey, they are also human beings that want to have a connection with you. And I think as long as you reciprocal in that relationship, that'll go a long way, right? Don't.
Jens, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Michael. I'm excited to see you again, my friend.
Now, you are a very established W-2 guy, as most people are on this journey. But so let's rewind the clock a little bit. I'm curious to see what was your occupation, and then more importantly, what happened to you? What you developed some kind of discontent where you started looking at real estate, and I'm curious to know, find what were you doing, and then what got you into thinking real estate in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I came from Denmark 27 years ago, I think it is now. So, we have that that European background to share. And, I did what I thought I was supposed to do, right? Got a education, got a W-2 job, worked for 25 plus years in IT. I loved the job. It was great. But my challenge was I didn't have any meaningful impact on my income, right? So in my mid 40s, I started to develop a little bit of a discontent in the sense like, man, do I want to do this for another 20 years? Do I want to work for somebody for another 20 years? And I couldn't really see what direction to go in. Everything looked like a job. And that's when I stumbled on the idea of investing in real estate. It's like, oh man, here's the avenue where you can, disconnect your time from your income. And it started out kind of, I was like, that's what I need to do because I was tired of having to keep up with the IT world and learning something new and all these young people, that were just so much quicker at learning stuff. So it was really challenging for me. And that's kind of when I was like, oh man, real estate, just the light bulb kind of went off about, 8-9 years ago that I had to change.
How'd you get the light bulb? Did it have anything to do with a purple book, or did you get it some other way?
I wish I'd read the Purple Book earlier. It was actually it was one of the books that I picked up on Bigger Pocket. I think like How to Invest in Rental Real Estate by Brandon Turner or something like that. That was the light bulb that went off there.
And so how did you then execute on that plan, right? Because this is the problem. You read these books, and for me, I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, and he used confusing terms like real estate investing and cash flow business. So I was like, well, I'll flip houses. That sounds good to me, right? Now, what did you in your Danish mind, you translated that, and then what did you do from after reading that book?
Yeah, so I'm very actional. I like to take action, right? And I'm kind of take logical steps towards something. So I was like, okay, what does this look like, right? Luckily, the books, and I started, listening to podcasts and everything else. Like, what are the logical steps here? I wanted to know the recipe, right? That's kind of how I was thinking. And the recipe was like 1 to 4 units, right? You can get a 30-year mortgage on there. You can qualify through your with your own credit. We had some money saved up. It's like, oh, I can do this by myself with my dear wife. It seemed simple. It seemed approachable. And I was like, who do I know, right? So I started talking to people in my sphere. I was like, who invests in real estate? And I ran into a few different people, but everybody was kind of like doing smaller stuff. I was like, okay, I guess you do smaller stuff. So I started there, and luckily I got introduced to I guess he's a broker, right? And he's also, it's like, oh, I'd like to help new investors to buy smaller properties. Like, okay, let's do it, right? So as if for 1 minute or a couple of weeks, I looked at single family homes, and where I lived, it didn't make sense. I was like, wow, if I have to invest, a few hours from where I live, I knew that it didn't make sense to buy a single family house. I knew I didn't want to flip because I didn't have time, right? So it did make sense to do small multifamily early on.
And so you said small multifamily. And did you self-fund these things? You just kind of bought these smaller things yourself? Did you manage them yourself? Talk a little bit how you got into your first small multis.
Yeah, I mean, me and my wife, we had $200,000 saved up in a non-retirement account. That was all sitting in, stock market ETF. So it's 200K. I was like, we're willing to invest this. That's not nothing, right? When it came down to it, I probably wasn't willing to put it all into a few deals, but that was the start, right? And I I decided to, a couple of things that I really, in retrospect, did well. I decided to invest out of state. I was living in southwestern Colorado. Albuquerque, New Mexico was the biggest city that made sense. It's 4 hours, 3.5, 4 hours away. So I knew I couldn't self-manage. I knew it had professional management in it. That probably saved me from not trying to self-manage, because that so many people get stuck in that, right? They're owner operators and they get stuck in the management and never can scale, right? So at least I got that going for me. So self-funded, I think the first deal was $117,000 for 4 units. So you can imagine the quality of that, right? But it was still, two fourplexes within, I think, 2 or 3 months, about 8 years ago. So it was short. I took action once I knew what I was doing, right? Or what I wanted to do.
Well, we're going to talk about scaling, but before we get into scaling, because that's what we want to know is how do we scale? Where are you today? Number of units, that kind of stuff.
Um, over 2,000 units under ownership. I think we've done 35 deals. We have 40,000 square feet of warehousing space too. We got some Airbnb stuff. So, in 8 years, right? That's kind of what it has gone from zero to that.
Yeah, it's amazing. The one thing I love about this business, many things, but one is your ability to scale this business in a short period of time. It's really amazing because of these professional management. It's very exciting and maybe even stressful when you close a deal. And then once you put the manager in place, you're like, oh, you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, let's do it again. So you keep layering one over another. And that's really amazing. I mean, if I were to do it with companies, like I know people roll out companies, rolling up companies is really stressful. It can take like a couple years to stabilize the management team and then pull out. With this business, if you have a good property manager, you can do it in a very short period of time. So I love the scaling part of this, and there's a lot of people watching and listening to this. We're like, my gosh, I really want to scale my single family house portfolio, my multiple. How do I do it? Now I want to kind of couch this interview under what we call the 4 pillars of apartment investing success, because there's some things that we have to really pay attention to when we're scaling versus in a single family house world where it's maybe not as important, not as important at all. And there's really 4 of them. And one of them is being deal ready, building your team before you launch out and start calling brokers. There's some things you got to do. Number 2 is you got to get good at analyzing deals. Number 3, you got to get good at getting deal flow. And number 4 is you got to get good at raising capital. So those are typically the things that everybody wants to know about. So we're going to hit those the 4 pillars. So let's talk with deal ready. And you have now the benefit of hindsight, right? If you're just starting out, you might be stammering around and, kind of experimenting and doing it yourself and trying to figure out what works. But now in hindsight, especially when you're trying to, did your multis, but especially when you're trying to scale, how would you advise people to get ready, right? Because in the single family house world, I'd be like, well, I'm gonna call a broker. I'm gonna call them off the MLS and I'm gonna go visit the house and I'm gonna make an offer. Like that's my readiness, right? It's like
Is that the voice that you come up with too?
I guess.
Is that how you approach them with a southern accent?
That's just how I speak sometimes. I moved to Georgia a little while ago, and I guess this is my southern accent. It's awful, but that's those things like in a single family house world. I feel like it was like shoot, fire, aim kind of thing, and and it works pretty good, most of the time. But in hindsight, it didn't really serve me that well in multifamily, and I think as a result, I lost a lot of time. I later made a lot of mistakes, and so. Maybe with like I said, been of hindsight, what do you advise someone to get deal ready? Maybe even before you call that first broker, what are some of the things that are important?
Yeah, I think, first of all, of course, syndicating and going in with partners, it's a great avenue, but are you ready? Are you ready and willing to take on partners? Maybe and maybe not, right? So what does the first deal look like? Is it your own capital or is it with partners or investors or whatever? And you have to not just, I can go and bigger. Are you actually ready to take on that responsibility that is to raise money and be part of that? I think that's one thing to look at, right? And some people say, you should scale immediately. Maybe not, right? If I look back, would I have done it differently? With what I knew then, no, because I didn't know anything else, right? So I would probably spend a little bit more time getting educated, right? What are the right markets you want to invest in, right? What are the economic drivers? What's the, what is the local government? What does it look like from from a tax and insurance standpoint? What is the growth? All these different things. Make sure you buy in the right market. Make sure you buy in the right neighborhoods. Because as you know, right, this cheap stuff, the Class D stuff looks very appealing on paper, but in reality, it's very different, right? Make sure that you know that underwriting process. You don't need to become an expert in underwriting, but at least have the fundamentals in underwriting. And I do see a lot of people get stuck there because they're engineers, they're IT people, and they're like, oh, I can underwrite my way to success. No, you can't, right? I mean, you have a great model that I use all the time, but don't like let that hinder you from making progress, right? I think just going out there and start networking and finding people that can help you, that maybe partners, it may be brokers, it may be other investors, but get as much education you can, both from courses and mentors and in the local market. I really love, and I run a meetup here, I love meetups and so forth because people will share. I'm very surprised about how open this community is. So people will share and so forth, right? So there is that initial phase of education and networking and getting kind of ready, right? Look at your own resources, look at other people's resources. Who do you need on your team? So I think, that's kind of some of the things I think of when you say that.
Well, let's talk about a team for a second, because I was just going to say, you mentioned it by the by, but let's shine a light on it, because again, in the single family house world, the team was much less important. And the reason is because you don't really need, years of a track record buying rentals. Like a broker will take you seriously buying your first rental, well, because, well, you live in a house, typically you've bought a house. And so people go, okay, it's not a big deal, but you call a broker. This is what happened to me. I flipped like 20 houses at their 30 houses. I call a broker and they're like, yeah, Michael, well, how many apartment buildings have you done? And I'm like, well, none, but look at all the houses I flipped. Because yeah, wow, how about this? You send me your proof of funds and I'll send you a deal. I'm like, what? I'm like, what are you talking about? Look at, and he got no credit for that. And I found now that, it doesn't really matter what your track record is, really the team behind you. Let's talk about the team and, who should you have in a team? Who are some of the more important members of that team? And then how do you leverage that to overcome your lack of experience?
Yeah, it's funny. I was so confused about the idea of teams. What did the team mean back in the day? I couldn't really figure it out, right? And I realized there's two, later on, there's two pieces, two kind of broad categories you need on your team, right? There's your internal team, if you will, right? So those are your partners, potentially, right? If you need a partner, let's say you are very good at underwriting, but you hate calling brokers. So maybe you need somebody in your team to be that extroverted individual to go and call brokers. So, maybe you need somebody that's good at bringing capital. So that's what I call my internal team, right? Those core partners that is going to be the ownership group of it. Yeah, if it's a single family house, a duplex, a quad, that's maybe just one person yourself, right? Maybe it's just one, or maybe it's your rich uncle who is willing to put up the money. Or if you go to syndicate, 200 units, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10 people, right? But that's your internal team. And then of course the second part of it then is the external team, right? So that would be your broker, that would be your insurance agent, it would be your loan broker or your mortgage broker, it would be property management, it would be your general contractor for the rehab, all these different things, right? That's much more complicated because when do you build that team? Do you build it before you get a deal? Do you build as part in the middle as you are moving towards closing and afterwards, right? There's definitely some people like the broker, and how do you persuade a broker to take you seriously? The proof of fund, right? Yeah, then that's always a challenge. There's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem there. So on your first larger deal, you may have to find a partner that has done this a few times before and say, hey, yeah, I have not bought a 50 unit, but we have because my partner Joe has done a deal before, right? Or, you have a mentor or a coach or somebody else you can have that's on your team. I think that's really the only way you overcome that. Once they start asking for proof of funds, you've kind of lost them in the little ways because they don't trust you at that point, right? So we can definitely dig into some of these teams and how you build more of those.
Now, do you think that it's market dependent as to how easy it is to be able to get a broker to buy into your story and award you a deal?
I think it's more timing timing specific. I mean, right now when we're speaking here in the middle of 2024, the brokers are not nearly as busy as they were 2 years ago. So they're probably more likely to take your call. Of course, it's also much harder to close a deal right now, given, the interest rates
Like
and so
getting
forth.
in. My point with that question was, yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. But getting in right now, if you're listening and you're thinking about, oh, I don't know how to piece these things together, get a broker take me seriously. They're not doing many closing dinners right now. So
Yeah.
so get out, you can get out in front of it, make a lot of headway now. And then when things get better, you're already positioned properly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think showing up, right?
let's talk about that, Jens. Yeah, let's talk this because the third pillar is deal flow, and we're talking about getting deals from brokers, and how do you do that? How do you build trust, right? Because in the single family house world, you just get on the MLS and you submit an offer, right? And so that doesn't really work. You can't really go to, well, you can, but you really get deal flow through brokers. And then what Garrett was saying is, how do you break in? How do you get them to take you seriously? And I think that's definitely one thing. You talked about having a partner, having a team behind you to leverage that. But what you really want to do is you want to get the off-market deals. You want to get that broker to share deals with you that no one else sees, or maybe a very small number of people. And I'll ask both of you guys, and Jens, you go first. And what can you do to accelerate that process so it doesn't take years, but maybe just weeks? What can you do when you're dealing with new brokers or you're getting into a new market? What do you do to kind of accelerate that process?
Well, deals are made by, I think, in today's world of internet and Zoom and everything else, I think you build trust by showing up, right? You travel to the market and you call up the brokers, say, I'm going to be there next week to look at some deals. I would love to, take you for lunch or coffee or whatever it is. I mean, literally, and this is 8-9 years ago. The first broker I met, he's the only broker I've ever used in this market in Albuquerque. He's a partner with me on a couple of deals as well. And I took the opportunity to drive, 4 hours to meet with him and get to know him. And every time I was there, I would meet. So you build the trust. I think one way you build trust is by showing up, right? Showing your face, showing up, and just be honest and vulnerable about what it is you want to achieve. And then of course, right, you're serious when they send you some deals, you underwrite them, you give them feedback and say, well, yes, I love the deal, but this is what works for me and what doesn't work, and so forth. So I think, hey, they are also human beings that want to have a connection with you. And I think as long as you reciprocal in that relationship, that'll go a long way, right? Don't be like the guy who calls once, every 6 months. Hey, do you have a deal for me? That doesn't work, right?
That's a